we've still never had a full accounting for how significant of a legal change the Patriot Act and the post 9/11 legal authorities empowering the new security apparatus, how significant those changes are. Um, so, 2001 forward, I really think, in the proper chronology here, the only people who really got this account right at the time were libertarians.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You are listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf. My guest today is Theo Wold, who works at the Claremont Institute and heads up their Administrative State Project. And Theo, welcome. I will let you introduce yourself more, tell us more about your background, what you were doing prior to Claremont, and what the Administrative State Project is.
Yeah, certainly. Gosh, that's always kind of a Herculean task. So I'm a trained lawyer. Prior to working with Claremont, I was the Solicitor General of Idaho. Served as the acting assistant attorney general in the Department of Justice at the end of the Trump administration, and then prior to that, was in the Trump White House for 3 years. I think I always say I think the most important detail about my background is I was raised in a working class family, and sort of that paraphrase that Lincoln has of Gray's elegy, the short and simple annals of the poor. That informs a lot of my perspectives on sort of the structure of government, how well it works for the citizens of this country, and who ultimately it ought to be accountable to, who government is actually serving, at least in our regime type. So, and the Administrative State Project at Claremont, consistent with a lot of Claremont's ongoing policy and sort of scholarly activities, is really centered on getting a handle on the changes in our federal government, and also in many ways state governments, since so many of them are essentially, I wouldn't say carbon copies, but at least parallels. They copy and paste so many of the structural changes in our federal government. So getting a handle on that, and then really trying to match up the current reality with the constitutional order that the framers designed, and determining where the delta is, and then of course how we might return our current structure of government, how we might pare it back and return to some principles that are more consistent with what the founders created and also envisioned for the American regime. So it's a good project. It's obviously necessary and vital in this current moment. But as a facet of that, also, we are taking a hard and long look at what many are calling the deep state. The sort of national security apparatus combined with what so many call the administrative state, and understanding how the growth of these powers, the power to investigate, surveil, and prosecute American citizens, often those three functions combined in the same entity or person, how those are a particular and new threat to liberty.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Excellent. This is exactly where I want to take us with this idea and refining what the deep state is. I think a lot of our listeners by now, and if they haven't, they can go back and listen to old episodes, but they will have an understanding of the administrative state as an unaccountable fourth branch of government, and especially when you were talking about your background as how that sort of relates to how you think about how or how not government currently as it's structured is accountable or not to the people, as outlined in the Constitution and the framers' regime. But what is the deep state, and how is it different or distinct from, but also connected to the administrative? How do those two things interplay with each other?
Yeah, I think this is an important it's an important feature of the current discussion, in part because, there are a lot of, I think, fully respectable scholars, elected leaders on the right who want to say, look, the deep state is just the administrative state. It's essentially the same complaint, albeit with a few more additional powers. So they're the people trying to make you swap out your light bulbs. They're the ones who are saying this constitutes an organically grown vegetable or this one doesn't. And these are the same folks who tell you, hey, you can't build that in your backyard because your backyard has now been declared a wetland or a seasonal pond. I don't think that's exactly correct. I think actually that's more appropriately labeled the administrative state, the capacity of administrative bureaucrats operating in various bureaus, sub-agencies, agencies, and departments in the federal government to essentially legislate and then interpret their own legislation and then enforce the interpretation of those rules. So, or as I say, legislation. So the EPA is like the classic example of the administrative state, that they are creating regulations. They have their own administrative judges, or at least are rendering interpretations of their rules that then go before Article 3 judges, and then they are assessing, in some instances, criminal, but many instances civil penalties on American companies, American citizens for violations of these rules. That's the administrative state. The deep state, at least in my telling, is that phenomenon, but combined with the functions of the national security apparatus. And I think that's an important distinction, in part because for so long we have, at least on the right, as conservatives, lionized the security intel state. Look, like, as I often say, just pick up any Will Smith movie from the late 1990s, right? Men in Black, or his movie with Gene Hackman against the deep state. It's all about, the FBI and the CIA will keep you safe. They are often, war veterans or war heroes in their own right, who then join the intelligence bureaucracies, and their goal is to keep the boogeymen out of the homeland. That's our version. That's not of course, the left has propagandized this, but the right, has gleefully accepted that sort of apocryphal version of the intelligence apparatus, when the reality is much closer to what, far left radical, representatives in Congress would have said in the 1970s. People like Frank Church, who would have said, essentially, you have a massive bureaucracy with enormous legal authorities and incredible resources at their disposal, and they are engaged in surreptitious activity abroad and in the homeland that really makes the elected leaders of the country, if not superfluous, certainly in many instances a functional nullity. And so I think it's really important to get this lexicon and sort of the description correct, because we've still never had a full accounting for how significant of a legal change the Patriot Act and the post 9/11 legal authorities empowering the new security apparatus, how significant those changes are. So 2001 forward, I really think, in the proper chronology here, the only people who really got this account right at the time were libertarians, who said, look, like, the trade-off isn't worth it. You're giving them enormous unfettered powers to surveil and to investigate potentially American citizens. And then these same people will be the ones charged with carrying out prosecutions and everything that comes with that, including, in many instances, as we've seen now over the years, indefinite detention. that's a really dangerous idea, guys. Maybe we shouldn't do that. And the message from so many law and order conservatives of the time was the threat from international Islamic jihadi terrorism is real. It's not going away, number one. And number two, even if the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Central Intelligence Agency, and some of these other sort of security state actors wanted to investigate or surveil American citizens, they just don't really have the capacity. It's too much information, it's too much data, and the collection capacity isn't precise enough to create essentially a panopticon observing and studying the behavior of 300 million Americans. And the Constitution, of course, will protect us. Now, flash forward 23 years later, and what we've learned is, well, with machine-based learning and AI, the capacity for the deep state to read your text messages or mine is certainly there, and it's being used. And moreover, you know, the classic trade-off that every Article 3 judge who sits on a FISA court is confronted with, which is these folks over here are telling you the Constitution is an obstacle to this investigation or to this proceeding, but we over here are telling you you'll have blood on your hands because it'll lead to a terrorist attack. Nearly every Article 3 judge has answered that Sophie's choice by giving more discretion and more authority, more power to the intel bureaucracies at a clip of nearly about 99.8% affirmance of requests from the intel state to proceed either with wiretaps or warrantless searches and the like. So the Constitution, when put up against sort of the specter of exigent circumstances, all too often seems to fall by the wayside. So to wrap up here, long-winded account, I think the administrative state is properly understood as exercising all kinds of extra constitutional authorities, in particular, the combination of legislative, judicial, and enforcement authorities in one actor or one bureau. But then the deep state is layering on this additional capacity to get at, as Justice Alito has said many instances, your filing cabinet. Whether that filing cabinet is a cell phone, your personal computer, your emails, to read that information, to sift through it, to create a composite sketch of your political activities, your commercial or economic behaviors, and to use that if necessary when a time may present itself for your interrogation, your prosecution, and potential detention. That's totally new and completely unheard of in America's sort of constitutional history.
That's a great start. You've already touched on it. I'm wondering if we could just delve a little bit deeper into the core elements of the deep state, not only the agencies, so like, NSA, CIA, FBI, DOJ, probably a few others that I'm not thinking of, but also the instruments that they use, whether it's, the FISA courts or, machine learning or, collusion with other, whether it's banks or things. So what are the elements and the instruments that are essential for the deep state to function the way that it does?
Yeah, and I think I'll take one other sort of theoretical pass at your first
Sure.
question in answering this one, which is to remind your listeners that part of our challenge here is articulating a description and a conceptualization of the deep state that is not driven by just mere conspiracy theory. And that's a real mistake that our side makes all too often, which is like this account that Jim Comey and members of the current OD&I leadership under Biden and Clapper and Brennan all meet with secret decoder rings in the basement of Comet Pizza in DC or something, right? And there's hand signals and everyone is reading the same playbook. I think that's like a gross mischaracterization, and it leads to our otherwise, I think, fully defensible articulation of how different the deep state is from the constitutional order envisioned by the framers. It leads that whole issue to being so easily lampooned and dismissed. So it's not a fever dream like decoder ring conspiracy. And yet, and yet, a lot of these actors seem to move in some kind of scripted synchronization. And I think that's the perfect place to start in answering your second question, which is, so who are these people? And why are they moving in synchronization, or seeming synchronization? And I think the first thing to say, is the obvious institutional actors are most of what you just named: the Department of Justice, the Bureau, the Central Intelligence Agency, parts of the State Department. But there are other actors that are largely overlooked. I mean, it's not commonly known by most Americans that there are 26 intelligence gathering agencies and bureaucracies now in the federal government. I mean, who had ever heard of CISA until 3 years ago, right? I mean, it's a relatively recent vintage, but those authorities were possessed by DHS until even before CISA was created as an official organization.
Real quick,
So
what
there
is that?
are a number. CISA is the, gosh, sorry, I should know the acronym offhand. It's the Cyber Infrastructure Security
Okay.
Agency at DHS. Now, its mission is ostensibly um, to secure and harden our cyber infrastructure, particularly of the federal government or any federal government related entities, Hoover Dam, to HHS's employment record database. But it has expanded that footprint, again, under the auspices of fighting terrorism, to sweep in all kinds of activities that you and I would find, to be just a normal part of American life, including, as was reported earlier last year, surveilling and investigating traditional Latin Mass parishes in the Catholic Church in the United States, under the ostensible claim that those are or those entities have individuals who are participating in domestic terrorism or are sources for right-wing radicalism. So 26 different entities collecting intelligence, a lot of which is coming from domestic sources. That's surprising to a lot of Americans. Another facet of this are, Article 3 courts, the big players that people hear about, and I don't know if are made as sort of a mental note, but the Eastern District of Virginia and the Southern District of New York, and then, of course, the District of Columbia District Court is where a lot of these requests for investigations, for warrants, for the presentation of what is otherwise classified material, that's where these are argued. And as I said earlier, these courts, and then the FISA court, which is a special court structured in the late 1970s to provide a forum for intelligence agencies to present, requests for warrants or essentially almost extrajudicial proceedings, if you will, so that they can be blessed by the judicial branch. That court is, I mean, for any constitutional scholar, anyone who takes separation of powers seriously, it's an odd duck. The membership of the court is exclusively appointed by the Chief Justice. The credentials for participation in the court are essentially at his discretion, but what has proven to be the case over nearly 40 years now of activity, most of the members are judges who in their previous careers had some involvement with the national security apparatus. They were lawyers at the Bureau. They served in the secret intelligence agencies, CIA and ODNI. So they're individuals who supposedly have technical or experiential insight, but at the same time, they are individuals who have some affinity for the way that these agencies conduct themselves and the personnel that comprise those bureaus. So, and as I said a moment ago, the success rate of the government in presenting its findings and justifications for requests for warrantless searches or surveillance programs, for wireless taps, you name it, is about 99%. There have only been over 40 years 30 requests that have been denied by the FISA court. And I think the last part of the deep state, coming around to where we started, which is who are these people? I think on one hand, it's a really easy sort of um, caricature to say these are GS-12, GS-13 government bureaucrats who have served in these agencies and bureaus for the whole of their career. You've never seen their names or their faces in the newspapers. They're essentially anonymous actors who are given, a great deal of authority. I mean, that's true insofar as it goes. Uh, but at the same time, what we increasingly see is you also have, former Facebook executives who enter into, various roles, political appointments or advisory boards in the national security apparatus. We have, executives from some of the major banking houses who have participated in, again, either through advisory board appointment or actual political appointment under certain administrations. And so the point there is you have what are essentially low-level, civil bureaucrats, but you also have incredibly accomplished, credentialed, successful private sector executives who have participated in the security apparatus as well. In other words, there isn't really an easy sort of caricature you can draw of the personnel, but here's the thing that sort of connects them and explains in many ways the seeming synchronization, which is they're products of the same institutions. They're educated in the same schools. They've been shaped and formed by the same sort of mentors, either academically or professionally. They read the same magazines, the same books. In many instances, they frequent the same restaurants and vacation spots. So it's not like there is a secret manifesto informing the view of the low-level GS-12 or 11 employee at the bureau and the high-level executive who is going to, take the revolving door in and out of service in big tech and then back into the federal government. No, there's no secret manifesto. It's that, they're reading the New Yorker. They're all graduates of Columbia or Harvard, and they vacation in the same spots. Their kids go to the same schools, and generally their worldview is fairly consistent. And that is where I think we on the right start to encounter some of our real challenges with the deep state, is that it is ultimately an unaccountable bureaucracy empowered with these very sophisticated tools to pry into the innermost sanctum of citizens' lives. And the vast majority of those who are exercising these authorities or using these tools have really no sympathy or no understanding of the lives lived by people, in Atchison, Kansas, or rural Idaho.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I mean, you already mentioned, the deep state's sort of, it's been around. This is not like a brand new thing, and I think I'll ask you to sort of backfill the history for us. But before we get there, like I first heard of it probably 2021 or maybe it's 2019, 2020. President Trump's talking about the deep state is corrupt. It's coming after me. We need to drain this. We need to dismantle the deep state. And I was sort of thinking he was talking about the administrative state, but also these entrenched institutions, legacy media, social media, which of course had a major role to play in how the 2020 election played out. These other sort of maybe institutional individuals as well, these major players in finance, banking, and they have this, and they're going to the same schools like you said, and they're sort of enriched or immersed in this culture. So that's what I sort of thought about. I guess maybe this is a very cerebral question, but what is the difference between the deep state and the Yarvin's idea of the cathedral?
I think it's a great question. If only I guess one take at it would be Yarvin is, and I'm sure he would bristle at this, but with his use of the metaphor of the cathedral, he's essentially positing sort of a political philosophical claim, and the description of the deep state is a much more mechanical description of practical politics. But for all intents and purposes, I think his cathedral metaphor is very helpful. I think it's extremely helpful, and it's one I would encourage everyone, if you're not familiar with it, visit Gray Muir or listen to one of his podcast appearances. He always gives a fairly consistent description of it. But the idea, essentially, that there's lots of activity going on inside of one edifice, and not all of it is pre-planned or in direct coordination, but people are drinking essentially from the same sources. They are sort of motivated by the same sort of either intuitive sense or soft cultural factors that shape their views. And so what appears like a well-structured conspiracy is actually just sort of a testament to the intellectual, spiritual, emotional formation of a whole class of elites. And I think in many ways that is true of the deep state. Something you said a moment ago, I think, is so that's the other piece of this that is often left out in our accounts, which is well, then what do you say about big tech and the corporate media establishment, and some of the I'd even sweep in some of the professional sports leagues at this point. And the idea there again is there is something of a revolving door between those who exercise authority and power inside of the federal governing bureaucracy, and who ends up being the head of security or information technology at Oracle or Google, or who ends up taking the general counsel position at the National Hockey League, or who serves as a beat reporter or a Sunday morning talk show host on one of the corporate media outlets. So look, they work hand in glove. Again, are they a part of the same sort of mechanistic structure? Like, no. Like, NBC doesn't work for the Department of Justice. It doesn't take its orders from the State Department. But you have an individual like Jen Psaki, who had a senior role within the governing bureaucracy, was familiar with sort of classification schemes, classified information, had a top-level security clearance, and then her next move is then to go in and shape the regime's talking points for a corporate media outlet. I think that's a part of this, and no one has done a better job of sort of putting this into perspective than Molly Hemingway's work on sort of the censorship regime. And I think the electoral integrity project that was constructed and housed within the security state, that was at the behest of DHS, the Department of Justice, and a number of other federal governing bureaus that then approached Stanford University and some other private actors to construct this project outside of the auspices of the federal government. So the origin is developed internally. It's then passed off to these third-party actors, who then create an apparatus that is informed by the information and intel passing back and forth between the federal government, security state, and actors on the outside. It is then used to suppress conservative speech, conservative institutions, even silly things like memes, jokes online, anything that was potentially disruptive to a certain narrative arc in the 2020 election. The Election Integrity Project was designed to suppress and control, ultimately, which is a word that, isn't often used in the American context, but to censor speech, in particular, as it turns out, generally from conservative actors, conservative voices, conservative institutions. So the idea that, again, that you could take intelligence gathering authorities that were created in response to the September 11th terrorist attacks and weaponize those to be used against potentially disruptive political speech or misinformation by American citizens in the context of a presidential election. I don't think anyone saw that coming. I don't even think the libertarians back in 2001 had an account that that's what this would eventually grow into.
What about, because we have a federal system of government, it doesn't work as well as probably it used to with incorporation and the way that the federal government ties federal funding to compliance on certain laws and rules. But how do the states, especially you as a former Solicitor General, deal with the deep state? And even at this point, we could even probably broaden that to the administrative state more generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned a moment ago the history. I think unpacking
I'll
that
go for it
is
then.
sort of essential
Yeah.
in answering this question. Yeah, let me just a quick sort of take on this, which is a lot of this really has its origin in the Truman presidency. And anyone, there's plenty of folks on the right who have this sort of I would say bizarre, interest in Harry Truman, this affinity for Harry Truman. But Truman's real challenge was, um, as he would say many times in private correspondence, controlling or getting at the generals. That the generals had enormous resources, immense popularity, and they had a sophistication, in his view, that it exceeded what should be the civilian control over military planning, military resources, and ultimately national security strategy, which is a term really that comes about in the Truman presidency, the idea of national security. And through a series of executive orders and statutory enactments in a fairly compliant Democrat Congress, Truman creates what is now the modern security apparatus: the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, something of the Joint Chiefs, and all under this idea that how could you bring the generals to heel? How do you make MacArthur and Marshall and these guys sit in the corner and heed the executive's authority? Well, the executive will have all of the intelligence. The executive will have total control of the flow of information. And I think what we see instead, and this has been written about by scholars far more sophisticated and intelligent than me, than I, is what we instead see is that the chief executive has very little ability to control the flow of information. So, I often say the Oval Office is one of the loneliest places in D.C. and the federal government. It's essentially Robinson Crusoe on a desert island. You, as chief executive, as president, know what is going on insofar as the CIA or the Bureau or your chief of intelligence are willing to tell you. And we've already seen this, right? Like there have been discussions on the left about what should be included if Trump wins. Should he have access to all levels of classified information? What should be included in his briefings? Or these intimations that Trump's own directors of the CIA withheld information because they were concerned about the president's ability to keep the information classified or secure. So they were curating what they would share in the Oval Office, predicated on their assessment of the people's elected president. And that, I think, is the rub, which is what the Truman structure has given us is in many ways, and I don't think this goes too far, you have essentially a formal elected sort of architecture. The Supreme Court justices in their robes, the President of the United States, the inauguration ceremony, a ritualistic transfer of power. You have members of the Senate and the members of Congress. But the actual power exercised in our government belongs to the administrative and deep states, the bureaucrats who remain despite changes over in Congress, control of Congress, who remain despite transfers of authority under a presidential administration, who control the flow of information, who structure the briefings for the Senate Intel Committee or for the President of the United States, and who have the actual capacity to put together the mosaic of what are U.S. interests abroad, what is our our capacity, where are we involved, and in what form. Is it classified? Is it secret? Is it publicly known? And I think this is something that Burnham essentially wrote about. I mean, his example was Russia, but he said a fascinating development in the early 20th century is the death of parliamentary you know representative or deliberative chambers all around the world, and his example of Russia was, the growth of these bureaus, these sub-agencies, and the fact that those actors develop the actual expertise of governance. They have the information, the technical statistical data, and then ultimately they're the ones promulgating the rules that are the basis of the law, or the regulations that form the basis of law. And then, in Burnham's phrase, he says, look at where sovereignty is localized. And if the people who control the information and develop the schematic for the structure of the law in regulations, memorandum, interagency rules, if that's what's happening, then de jure, de facto, that's who controls the regime. And so I think for states, the problem is twofold. One, as I said at the outset, a lot of states have essentially just carbon copied the federal government org chart, right? We need a health department, we need a labor department. So they have literally imported the administrative state model into their state governments. And I think this is a real challenge for red states, which is you're essentially trying to achieve conservative policymaking in what is a liberal architecture for governance. I mean, it doesn't track at all with what the framers would have conceived of, or even, some of your 19th century conservative stalwarts would have envisioned for state government. The second challenge is state governments are no different in their dependence and reliance on the security state apparatus. It's just at a smaller scale. Go anywhere in the country, pick your red state, Louisiana, Arizona, Oklahoma, and local law enforcement will essentially boast, they brag about their relationships with their regional FBI bureau office, their ability to work with federal interagency partners on drug interdiction task forces, or in doing anti-trafficking work, which is essentially to say intelligence and security information, the tools to prosecute complex, sometimes multi-jurisdiction cases against cartels or criminal gang affiliations, all depends upon what information and what resources the federal intelligence apparatus is willing to share with local law enforcement. So red states or state governments are particularly prostrate to the administrative deep state apparatus. In many ways, they are worse off than the fight that conservatives have in DC. And so how do you combat this? I mean, look, the one thing I've tried to articulate consistently, which comes back to the way I introduced myself, which is that at some point, American conservatives are going to have to square themselves with the idea of being ruled by experts. And you either accept that as British conservatives did years ago, and you say, look, like we agree with the central thesis of liberalism in our time, which is that modernity has created a social, political, economic structure that is too complex, it is too sophisticated, and because of advent in technology and progression in science, we cannot trust everyday people to wield sovereign authority. It's just beyond their grasp. A farmer, a butcher, a shoemaker, they can't be the ones exercising sovereign authority. We've got to empower PhDs, microbiologists, astrophysicists to run our government. You either agree with that thesis, as British conservatives have, and you say, well, ultimately what we're talking about then is ensuring that we have some kind of control over these experts. We do personnel evaluations, or we get to control how much they pay themselves, some semblance of control. Or, as our framers did, you fight for and affirm the thesis that no, in our regime type, and this isn't, we can debate the sort of underlying assumptions that Madison and others make about the Democratic regime type, but in our regime type, the central sort of claim is that the people rule and they are sovereign, and there is no problem too complex, because the assumption of our regime is that sort of common sense deliberation and the adjudication of everyday life, of everyday experience, will guide us through whatever difficulty we encounter, whether it's one dealing with climate change, or one dealing with centralized banking and monetary policy. Unfortunately, where we are is some kind of halfway house between both of those, right? We don't want the EPA bureaucrat telling us, you can't have that light bulb. Well, who the hell are you to tell us that I can't have this kind of, I refuse, right? Throw the tea into the Boston Harbor. I refuse to be told by this EPA bureaucrat somewhere in some rabbit-warren office in DC what will and will not constitute a sufficiently environmentally friendly light bulb. On the other hand, we say, look, the Fed has to be empowered with these tools, because this is too sophisticated for Congress to legislate. It happens too quickly. And these people, they're bankers, they're financial experts, they're PhDs in microeconomics, they're smarter than you, and they need to make these determinations. So we're in a very strange, I think, halfway house of rejecting rule by expert and always affirming it at the same time. And until we get clear, we essentially come to some kind of conclusion. Yes, we accept the progressive thesis, and we're going to be, tinkering on the margins and the edges. Or no, we reject it full scale. We'll never really have a workable solution to the abuses of the deep state and administrative state power. Not until we square ourselves with that.
Yeah, that reminds me of something Henry Olsen said recently on one of our podcasts. It was like, appetite for government right now is very large. Even in, purportedly red states, he brought up how Alaska, they still have, the governor tried to, shrink the size of government, and there was a big blowback from, Alaska's, I'd say, pretty solidly red conservative state. And I think just a lot of people do sort of what you're saying is there's still a large sense that, we do need and rely on government, and we have for a long time. So that's a major cultural and political change. I want to ask, and I think it gets us to a great place to ask in the final few minutes about some solutions or fixes or more practical ways that we can think about and advocate for solving some of these problems. But I want to ask one more general question first, which is, when we make this distinction between the administrative state and the deep state, if we were to dismantle one but not the other, is there a way where that's possible, where it would dismantling the deep state ultimately undermine the administrative state as such? If we erode the basis of the administrative state, the sort of James Landis, technocratic premise, would that also cause with the doing away of the deep state, or?
It's an excellent question, and I think to sort of give this a descriptive account. Look, when Congress is essentially charged with exercising, as we all hear this word bandied about on cable news and in written publications, oversight. What is oversight? I mean, this is sort of this kabuki theater of that. Well, Congress still is the repository of power, legislative power, and whatever delegation they've made to executive branch agencies, it's only sort of on a leash. And so the executive agencies who have assumed this delegated power have to come and give an account of what it is they're doing with that power that Congress has given them. Here's the interesting thing that happens. Pick a senator, pick a member of the House. Do they know the inner workings of the NLRB at the Department of Labor? Do they have a staff of economists or statisticians who are running their own number spreadsheet on employment labor variations month to month? Do they have their own jobs report? No, what members of Congress do is they say, hey, you give me the information that I'm then going to ask you about. And it better match up with what you say. And this essentially is the description of the House and Senate intel committees, right? They don't have their own separate intel services. They don't have their own agents or human intel service members who are collecting their own account of what we're doing in Colombia or what our activities in Ukraine look like. They say, hey, come, tell us what you're up to. And the CIA or ODNI will say, sure, we'll give you an account that we think that you can handle. And that's a significant problem. So it's true in conducting oversight over the Department of Labor, and it's true in conducting oversight of the FBI. If you were to dismantle one and not the other, would it undercut, potentially, if I understand your question, would it undercut both? And here's the interesting thing. I think the security state apparatus is a far more significant threat, in part because, and this is where people will say, oh, there goes that Wold guy venturing into conspiracy territory. But I think the ability to undercut the authority and the integrity of members of Congress through blackmail, extortion, I think that's real. I think it's a real concern. I think if they are surveilling and investigating American citizens who attend Latin Mass Catholic parishes, they're certainly reading and surveilling the communications and correspondence of members of Congress. So asking Congress to reform a system that is essentially an existential threat, and for many of them, an existential threat to the thing they hold most dear, which is their continued service in Congress, I think it's asking for a heroic act from people who lack the courage to do heroic things. I think generally conservatives are, if I can quibble with one thing that was phrased just a moment ago in your account of what Henry Olson said, is we're still stuck on this idea about shrinking government, like the size. And we have a lot of really bad ideas that get circulated in this realm of like, well, what the problem is, it's just too big. And now, look, I would agree it's too big. I mean, the president makes 4,000 appointments, and usually when I offer that number to lay audiences, I say, yeah, he makes 4,000 presidential appointments, or he can. Oh my God, government's so huge, 4,000, that's crazy. And you say, so that's 4,000 political appointees to manage and oversee close to 3 million full-time civil bureaucrats and upwards of 10 million government contractors. That's how big our government is. Yeah, it's enormous. It's certainly too big. But it's less about its size and its actual authorities. That's the problem. I wouldn't want a smaller government bureaucracy that still possesses the ability to surveil, investigate, and prosecute American citizens, or to dictate what kind of food we can eat, what kind of cars we can drive. So it's actually a question about the legal structural authorities, and that's what conservatives really need to wrap their minds around. So the idea that, well, the FBI will be better if you just move it out of D.C., or Interior will be less invasive in blocking oil exploration and exploitation in the country and natural resource development if its offices are in Grand Junction, Colorado. No. You'll just metastasize the disease. Take any subway in DC, and you'll see all the placards along the advertisements that say, get a master's in public policy in natural resource studies at the University of Maryland. Get a master's in foreign diplomacy from George Washington, because they realize there's a whole built edifice to educating and credentialing the civil bureaucracy. That's not a DC problem. That's the administrative state and the deep state problem, and they're actors in higher education, in tech, et cetera. If you relocate the bureaucracy to Grand Junction, Colorado, you don't think the University of Colorado is going to open up a master's of public policy for interior, natural resource development? Of course they are. It's going to be the same problem. The same leftist academics educating government bureaucrats to think about the world the same way. So the size problem doesn't answer it. It's a legal authority problem. And getting at that, curbing the ability of the administrative state to make law or the intelligence agency's ability to gather and to surveil and to investigate American citizens contrary to the Constitution, those are the kinds of reforms that will go a long way. And moreover, picking up a theme that Walter Russell Mead had recently in Tablet, if we accept the left's account of the federal bureaucracy, that what they largely do is pure administrative work. They are just administrators of what Congress and the chief executive, on behalf of the sovereign, the people, have asked them to do. They're just stamping entitlement checks. They're just processing raw data. They're just doing basic IRS audits and issuances of tax returns. If that's all they're doing, then great. We can take artificial intelligence and machine learning and replace most of them, because it's pure functional, scripted behavior that has no discretion, needs no judgment, and so a human doesn't need to do that. So we could shrink the size of the federal government in terms of its total, human bureaucracy by enormous margins. But you and I both know that's not what is going on here. We know that civil bureaucrats, even GS10s, are exercising policy-making discretion. They're using their judgment. In many instances, they're using it to supplant what the people have requested their own representatives do or say about policy and about the law. And so I think unless you're willing to structurally reform some of the legal authorities, we're going to always be behind the eight ball. And then the last thing I'll just say on that question is, we've yet to encounter, and I think President Trump is our best hope in this score. We've yet to encounter a president who will take civil service reform, deconstruction of the administrative state, as seriously as the left has taken it in creating those authorities in those institutions. We have never had our Woodrow Wilson, who said, "Ooh, let's remake what the founders envisioned so that we have a liberal progressive government." We've never had our Jimmy Carter, who said, "We're going to embed labor organizing union principles in the protective architecture of the federal bureaucracy so they can never be fired." And so if we really want full-scale administrative state reform, it will have to be a priority. And not foreign policy, not the economy. This will have to be the priority. And that's asking a lot of a president, essentially, to go full scale on deconstructing the federal government as we know it. I think there's no other way. You can't legislate, you can't make policy as a Republican president or a Republican Congress when you don't have an administrative bureaucracy that's willing to assist you in those goals, those ends, because of their reluctance, the reticence, or just their general steadfast disagreement. So unless you reform it, you're kind of just wasting time. But the one-way ratchet remains. When they're in power, they accumulate more power. And when we are in power, we essentially just live by their rules and expect some kind of fantastical outcome without the work and the hard political gain of convincing the American people that they would be better off with a state that didn't read their minds.
And you sort of towards the end there talking about civil service reform in the sense of, I think, re-empowering the chief executive, the head of the country, elected by the people, with a unitary executive that Hamilton talked about, and was that Federal 71 and 72 is, then this is, I think, what Schedule F is sort of envisioned, is we should be able to make these people accountable to the president, which means firing almost at his discretion. I think, like, in principle, he should be able to dismiss any minister, or I guess that's what we call them back then. Now we call them administrators, bureaucrats. Be able to fire them now. So I wonder what that would do. Also, in your article that you wrote for the Up for Conservatism reader, I was shocked to hear about, because I remember one of the first things President Trump did was, every time we we add a new regulation, we're going to get rid of two, but that only works like 20% of the time, which was strikingly low, and I never, we never really heard about that. So also like streamlining,
Yeah.
or again making the discretion at the president or maybe at chief cabinet level positions who are more directly accountable to the president, for streamlining process that a president wouldn't know, but
Yeah.
the longtime career administrator would know. And then those two proposals, what you think of them, and then also what you would add or other things that you think concretely ought to be done for advising a president and reforming this.
Yeah, I think so. I applaud my colleagues who worked on Schedule F, who developed it. I think it's a good idea insofar as it goes. But remember, Schedule F would really only be looking at, a few thousand, 10,000 employees at best. And because of its introduction at the tail end of the first Trump presidency, uh, it will be challenged in court. It will be tied up in injunctions or litigation for years. So it's wrong. My point in the American Conservative piece I wrote a few weeks ago was to say, number one, you've got, as I said a moment ago, you've got to square yourself with, are conservatives okay with the idea that experts will rule us, not Congress, not the president, that the experts are in control of our government? If we're not okay with that, then we got to go way bigger than Schedule F. Schedule F is
Yeah.
just a piking on the surface. But two, we really have to reject this fable, this fantasy that the left has constructed, that we have these high-minded civil bureaucrats who are free of political prejudice, who operate, in pure objective fashion, and that's the story we've been told again since the early 20th century. That these men and women, through their credentials and their expertise, have surmounted basic human nature, and they're essentially automatons for the good. And we know that's not true. And yet the right consistently accepts this historical account of the creation of the civil bureaucracy. There's high-minded scientific civil bureaucrats, and over here you've got Jacksonian spoil system. And yet the spoil system, which again is a turn of phrase meant to denigrate, the system we had prior to the Pendleton Act in the late 19th century functioned enormously well for the country. We achieved great good under a system of political patronage and political appointment. And I think what we have instead is a severing of, as Madison called it, the chain of political authority. And Madison's view was it didn't just go to senior ministers. It wasn't just the Secretary of State that should be fireable and accountable to the chief executive. It goes all the way down, as he says,
Should
to
be
the
everyone.
lowest administrator. Only then can you truly preserve executive power, a unitary executive. And I think that needs to be the goal that we're striving for. So Schedule F is helpful in that sense, but not nearly far enough. And the danger that Schedule F presents, this is what is my concern, is that it convinces people that this problem can be solved just by one executive order. We'll just sign this document, and here it is, and goodbye, administrative state, gotcha. It's far more significant than that, and I think a lot of new voices on the right, Vivek Ramaswamy and J.D. Vance, have made this a central electoral issue, and that's key. I mean, again, if we really believe the people are sovereign, which I do, then to take their mandate, it must be campaigned on. It has to be campaigned on that the structure of government you have now is anathema to your liberty. And by making it a campaign issue rather than we'll just solve this problem through an executive order, you are creating the grounds for the people to give you that maneuverability next year, potentially next year, if Trump is as I assume he will be, returned to the White House. Then you have that mandate from the people to pursue this as a top line, a policy agenda item. I think I think so. Schedule F as one piece. There are lots of other things that could be done. One thing I'll say is I'm very circumspect about giving, because I hear this a lot. Well, Theo is good at picking apart people's ideas, but he offers none of his own. And maybe it's just a silly a silly dodge. But I will say one of our great liabilities is that we are too quick because we are interested in ideas, I would say, on the right. We are interested in ideas. We are interested in sussing out philosophical, sort of foundational claims for ideas, and because we are not monolithic. We don't all think the same way on the right. We're interested in the give and take of debate. We all too often give voice to some things that we should essentially keep concealed. And the lawfare apparatus that the left has constructed is aimed in large part at blocking or creating the strategies that will block some of these initiatives. So I think it's really important to be circumspect and discreet about what we discuss. In that way, I love Schedule F because they've trained their fire on Schedule F, and they have no notion of what else is being thought of. Now, as far as the 2-for-1, yeah, here's the thing that the federal courts have done. What Chief Justice Roberts taught us, shockingly, in the DACA fight. If you recall the origin of DACA, the program that allows the illegal alien children of illegal aliens to remain in the country through essentially prosecutorial discretion. The creation of that program, there's no statutory basis for it. There's no foundation in law. It all operates on the basis of a memo that then Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano authored and sent to the White House. And the view in the Trump White House that when we were working on deconstructing DACA was, oh, okay, so it's a memo. It's not an executive order. It's not a presidential memorandum. It's just sort of like an inter-office email. Well, then a memo should be beaten by a memo. You created it through a memo, so we'll take it down through a memo. And what Chief Justice ultimately says in that litigation is, no. In order to do a negative, to retract administrative state authority, you have to do a positive. In order to take down a memo, you have to engage in an affirmative rulemaking. You have to go through the whole process, just like you would for any regulation or any internal agency rulemaking. And what I think ultimately that the lesson learned there is, it's not so simply as striking things off the books. To strike things off the books, you first have to engage in the torturous, delayed, lengthy process of making a rule that says that previous rule is now gone. And that eats up so much time. It opens so many vulnerabilities for litigation and lawsuit. Again, and the left is far better at this than we are. If anyone wants to do some research on Democracy Forward, which is an entity that has done enormous damage to conservative governance initiatives and priorities. I mean, they have spent so much money. They have coordinated so many lawyers in academia, in private practice, to assist them in the efforts of stopping, blocking, deconstructing our policy objectives. The 2-for-1 deregulation agenda ultimately ran into a buzzsaw in court. It was a great concept, but it was not very successful in court. And part of that was because ultimately we did not have the same pliant bureaucracy that was willing to assist us in issue spotting, in developing the formalized record for certain regulations, or providing the necessary and correct information to defend those regulations. And that's where people will say, well, what damage does the administrative state really do? And that is probably its most destructive capacity, is to withhold information that could then be used in court to affirm certain regulations, or to provide faulty or inaccurate advice and counsel that will then be exposed in litigation or in court proceedings. And so, deregulation is important, but this also falls again into like the beaten dog syndrome of the right, which is, we'll accept the architecture that men like John Landis and FDR created, and Wilson, and we will live in it, but we just want it to be smaller and cost less money. And so we'll focus on deregulating these little aspects here. We'll keep the governing apparatus, but we just don't want that apparatus to make it hard to build pipelines. And my view would be, take down the entire apparatus and govern according to a conservative vision of what the federal government or state government should look like.
You just said so many things that, to unpack them all would take a whole other hour. I mean, I love what you said about discretion and prudence. And, that means you'll just have to be in the next admin and give all of just whisper it to the president. So no one else hears it. And then about the spoils system, like there are no solutions in politics. So the idea that, civil service reform was a solution. It was just taking one way of doing things, which has some problems, i.e., corruption and incompetence, and then replacing it with another set of priorities. But like the spoils system, effective, quick, and less expensive.
Nimble, quick, and I think most importantly, and this is something we really have to work on our side, is it actually
Yeah,
is democratically accountable. That is their canard that they run every time. Oh well, what Schedule F and all of these right wing lunatics want to do is deconstruct government and make it responsive only to a man or an ideology. And it's no. The Jacksonian system ensured that if the mail didn't get delivered, you knew what political
we have
party
regular
was responsible
elections.
for that, and you could
Yeah,
throw their asses out. Exactly right. And now we say, I keep voting. I vote for Bush and nothing changes. I vote for an Obama and nothing changes. I vote for Trump and maybe some things changed, but and the answer to that cynicism, that creeping cynicism that is so ultimately destructive of the confidence that everyday citizens must have in their democratic institutions. That cynicism's root is, yes, nothing changes because the bureaucracy actually has the power and you're not replacing them. They remain. From Republican to Democrat administrations, they
yeah.
remain.
It's a phenomenal point and very important. My last question, if it's all right, when you did
Yeah,
the section on the deep state at Publius, you assigned Shakespeare, and I was like, "What the hell is
yeah,
this?" Maybe you don't want to. You want to keep it circumspect, but make the esoteric exoteric. What does Shakespeare, all 500 years ago, have to tell us about the deep these? So this are the issues that we've been talking about in the last hour.
yeah. Three things. First, that there is a formalized elite in every society. Every society. The establishment of a governing order requires those who will actually carry out its mission or its sort of teleological end, if you will. The question is whether or not those elites are governed by something greater than their own ambition, avarice, their own self-interest. And Tocqueville says that our framers kind of found something that seemed to work, or maybe it worked for a time. But Shakespeare is replete with examples of what it looks like when a regime is governed by men who only answer to their own desires. Secondly, there was a deep state that existed in Shakespeare's day, and I think part of the esoteric writing of Shakespeare is to relay to those who have eyes to see it truths that would otherwise have to be concealed because they would be too dangerous for the regime, and the regime would do what it could to censor, suppress, or punish those who engaged in these kinds of ideas or mused about these kinds of concepts. And then I think the third would be, as I've tried to put some emphasis here in our discussion, that that there is actually a place for heroic virtue even today. Um, it's not Agincourt, it's not Runnymede, but taking on the administrative state in the name of truck drivers, oil rig workers, masons, farm hands, anyone who is laboring and expecting that this regime is in service of their family interests and their children's interests, fighting for those people to ensure that they have a more accountable government, that when it says it's doing things in their name, when it says it's providing minute by minute intelligence updates to the Ukrainians to assist them in their war making with the Russians, that's all done in the name of the brick mason who lives in Tulare, California. The DoD and CIA has no authority, no legitimacy to do that otherwise. And so I think there's something quite heroic in fighting for the brick mason's ability to say this government answers to me, and reading about displays of heroic virtue in Shakespeare. It's the same approach that my wife and I take with our children, which is you want to develop their palate for good things early, right? And the moral imagination is shaped by examples and exemplifications of moral virtue, seeing it, and in that Aristotelian way with tragedy, poetry and particularly drama has a real way of magnifying humanity, right? Of our humaneness, of our vices, of our moral incontinence, but also of our virtues. And so seeing these kinds of heroic, self-sacrificing, courageous acts in Shakespeare will, number one, magnify them so they become more obvious and more clear, but two, will inculcate a taste for that in the reader. And you will become, if not certain, more likely to do those things yourself. And our time right now, our present crisis calls for people of virtue to make sacrifices and to do hard things. Just moving pieces on the board around and calling it a victory isn't sufficient.
Well, excellent. That's a great place to close the episode. And I'll say I look forward very much to seeing what you do with the Administrative State Project in the coming year, and then also in what I'm also assuming is going to be the next administration at this point. But yeah, Theo, thank you so much for taking the time and walking us through all of this. I'll link everything that we talked about already in our show notes, but where are some of the places that people can find your work?
At Real Theo Wold on Twitter and Instagram and all the social media platforms, and then with the Claremont Center for the American Way of Life in DC. And I'd encourage everyone to sort of follow what Claremont is doing. We're always sort of stirring up some kind of controversy and producing a lot of good
Excellent.
scholarship.
Thanks again, Theo.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.